Welcome everybody to the Nietzsche podcast Q&A number 11. We have quite a few questions this time, so if you want to get in on a Q&A episode just like this one, then head on over to patreon.com/untimely-reflections and join up as little as $5 a month, because the patrons are the ones who get to ask me all of these. So without further ado, because we have so many questions, we're going to get right to it. And I'm going to be answering these in the order that they were received, starting with one from Karen Cox, who asks, who do you think is the best interpreter of Nietzsche? Well, best is kind of a subjective thing. I guess I would have to start by asking, what do you mean by best? Best for what purpose? In many ways, I think Walter Kaufmann is the best as far as a introductory interpretation of just understanding the basics of who Nietzsche is and what his philosophy actually says. A lot of people have problems with Kaufmann. I've talked about this in the past on the podcast. You know, there are those who would say that Kaufmann obfuscated certain things about Nietzsche's philosophy, that he softened Nietzsche, so on and so forth. And, you know, I've always held that I think to the extent that Kaufmann does go astray in interpreting Nietzsche, it's sort of a necessary corrective that is sourced to a particular historical period in time, when in the mainstream it wasn't uncommon to hear the sort of simple dismissal of Nietzsche that he's like the philosopher of the Nazis. And I think Kaufmann does a good job of sort of disassembling that. And I think he maybe pulls so far in the opposite direction of trying to make Nietzsche compatible with like a liberal democratic outlook on the world that, you know, he might willfully or otherwise ignore certain things about Nietzsche's philosophy that maybe he shouldn't have. I know I'm sort of speaking in general and abstract terms here, but if you pick up a copy of Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist, as a guide to the perplexed that just sort of goes over a lot of the basic ideas of Nietzsche and brings in quite a bit of nuance, Kaufmann is a wonderful sort of first interpretation of Nietzsche. After that, I would say, you know, then maybe you can get into some of the more creative interpretations of Nietzsche, like Heidegger and Deleuze and others. But I think just for the purpose of interpretation as a guide to the perplexed, for people who are just getting into Nietzsche and they need a secondary source to help them along, Kaufmann is just fine. Now, as far as the interpretation that most impresses me or something of that nature, I'm very impressed by Klosowski, and I'm also impressed by Sloterdijk. I think part of that is I've just read Nietzsche Apostle and just gone over that, but Sloterdijk achieves something where he's very creative and faithful at the same time, and a lot of the interpreters of Nietzsche that are very creative, like Deleuze and Foucault, are often not entirely faithful to Nietzsche's vision. But, you know, I don't know if I have really a definitive answer for, you know, who is the best overall, because I can usually find some, like a lot of the best interpreters, I think honestly are just people like Ken Geames and Brian Leiter and, you know, what Hollingdale has to say in his commentaries on Nietzsche, because oftentimes it's the interpreters who are really not trying to read anything new or creative or use Nietzsche as a sort of fertile ground for their own ideas, but are just trying to relay what Nietzsche said as accurately as possible and as clearly as possible, and to sort of constellate the ideas and the knowledge. Those are the interpreters that I really respect, and that's sort of the model that I take after. And it's hard for me to answer the question sort of with like one definitive person who's helped me along, because for me, well, I mean, quite frankly, I try to occupy that role myself, and I spend so much time, and I have spent so much time reading the primary sources and cross-referencing it with interpreters that, you know, usually I take one or two helpful things from each of them, but my interpretation is really, I've tried to construct it myself and not follow after any one of these interpreters, if that makes sense. So I don't typically recommend that people go to one of these interpreters as a first sort of resort. That being said, once you do get to the point of reading the secondary sources, yeah, you know, Kaufmann, Klosowski, then get on to like Deleuze, Heidegger, and so on and so forth. That would be my general sort of recommendation. Or Brian Leiter, Ken Geames, these type of people. Just read all of it. Stefan Zweig, Struggle with the Demon, is a great interpretation of Nietzsche. And we're going to talk about Eric Heller's book, Interpreting Nietzsche, later in the season. So I don't know. That's kind of like a non-answer. I'm not really going to give you like who is the best interpreter of Nietzsche, because I don't really know if I can answer that. Next question is from Yannick Agil. Any thoughts or opinions on Otto Weininger's critique on Nietzsche as presumably the biggest self-hater? Mere projection, or do you think there is something worthwhile to that notion? This is one of those questions that's, it's a bit speculative inherently, isn't it? I mean, we're kind of just sort of trying to get into Nietzsche's psychology and say what was going on in his inner life. And, I mean, all we can really have to sort of get at that question is a reading of his works, and I suppose his letters, his personality, what we know of his life. And I'll just say for myself, I don't personally get self-loathing from Nietzsche's words. I don't get that impression that that's where he's coming from. And you know, it's very hard to make a concrete, very clear argument as to why that is, other than just, I don't get a lot of those signifiers of like an inferiority complex or self-hating in his work. I mean, Weininger basically makes the argument that Nietzsche's entire self-affirmative philosophy comes out of this self-hatred. Basically, the argument is that Nietzsche is, you know, his rejection of Wagner and the Wagnerians is sort of a like reaction against his own failure to flourish and succeed within the Wagnerian milieu. You know, he departs the Bayreuth Festival very disappointed and upset with Wagner and the direction his movement's taking. Wagner potentially spreads, maybe unintentionally, some nasty rumors about Nietzsche. They have their falling out. And, you know, it's after this that Nietzsche crafts this self-affirmative philosophy, this anti-romanticism, anti-Lutheranism, anti-Germanism. And, you know, there are ways in which you could see Nietzsche's, let's just take his statements about the Germans. You could see a lot of that as being incredibly extreme, that he harps on the Germans to such a degree, and he harps against Germanism and Deutschland über alles and German nationalism and just, you know, it's almost to a level where he, you know, Nietzsche says, I'll be known as the hater of the Germans par excellence, that his philosophy is just like essentially opposed to the German. And he's German, right? And so I can kind of understand what Weininger is saying in that respect. And we could also apply a lot of everything I just said to Nietzsche's relationship with Wagner, this sort of obsession he has with going after Wagner and Wagnerianism, which is sort of all tied into his like anti-Germanism. And yet at the same time, he has these very sort of, he betrays an admiration for Wagner, we'll say. He betrays that he also still has great affection for Wagner. And so a lot of that can seem like Nietzsche is a very hurt former friend of Wagner who both loves him and hates him in a way. And that, you know, this could be bound up with all sorts of feelings of resentment and so on and so forth. So I completely understand the psychological argument being made. But I don't think that Nietzsche associated himself with Germany. And I don't think that he was inevitably and permanently bound up with Wagner, right? When Nietzsche's attacking Wagner, I don't think this is actually an expression of self-loathing. I know you can make innuendo about that whole thing, but I don't think that somebody attacking their father figure necessarily means they're also attacking themselves. I don't think that somebody attacking and criticizing their countrymen means that they're attacking and criticizing themselves. And the very fact that Nietzsche sort of entertained the fantasy that he was descended from Polish nobility seems to indicate that he wanted to distance himself from the Germans, that it really, I mean, it might have been delusional, but Nietzsche was, I think, clearly trying to distance himself from the Germans. And I think there's just the feeling I get in his philosophy is this attempt to, like, liberate himself from any sort of conformity within a group, as far as his beliefs, his moral suppositions, his spirituality, even, we might use that word. Nietzsche wants to discover and craft all these things for himself, and he wants to be liberated from father figures and from the fatherland. And I think Weininger is kind of like conflating these things as inherently being attacks on oneself, which I suppose in some sense it is, but I think Weininger, he's a Freudian, as I recall, or he's like an acquaintance of Freud, and there might be a bit of Freudian exaggeration going on here, or just sort of Freudian fixation on one line of thinking that, oh, by criticizing the father, you are criticizing that which you are. And, obviously Wagner is not literally Nietzsche's father, but he was a father figure to Nietzsche, right? And he's associated with the German fatherland. That's what his movement is associated with. And I think that whole, network of sort of psychological associations is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for Weininger's interpretation, his justification for saying that Nietzsche is inherently self-loathing. I mean, he says he hated himself more than anyone in history other than perhaps Pascal, but at least Pascal had the honesty to say that I'm the most detestable, horrible human being. I'm a worm. Pascal would very much sort of embrace the self-loathing, whereas Nietzsche loathed himself so much that he even denies this, right? And so you can see from that kind of interpretation, right, it's almost like a stereotype with pop psychology, which is, frankly, I think what Weininger was doing there. It's really pop psychology, because he doesn't have any real evidence. He's speculating. Granted, Nietzsche does this a lot too, by the way, right? When he's sort of making his ad hominem attacks on other philosophers. But I guess what I'm saying here is that, one of the stereotypes of pop psychology is when, no matter what someone says, you can interpret it in order to make the point that you want to make. So Pascal admits that he loathes himself. Well, that we should take him at his word. Nietzsche would sort of hold self-affirmation to be, the ultimate goal, and love of life, embrace of who you are, become who you are. Well, even that is actually Nietzsche's compensation for the fact that he's actually self-loathing, and he loathes himself so much that he has to express the opposite of that. You see, you can sort of, if that's the point you want to make about someone's psychology, you can get there no matter what. You can take anything about the character. They go one way, you interpret it towards that end. They go the other way, you interpret it towards that same end. And so I guess I would just need more. I mean, he cites, as I recall, one passage in Zarathustra as part of his interpretation. And I remember reading that and being like, I don't see the self-loathing in this passage. I don't even see the subtext of self-loathing. I don't know what you're talking about. So there's very little concrete in what Weininger is saying. So to conclude, I guess I see what he's getting at to some extent. You can see a lot of what Nietzsche does within that compensatory framework that, Nietzsche's often been criticized along these lines. I mean, one of the easiest ways to talk about this is Nietzsche's vitalism. Well, it's the vitalism of a very sick, fragile man, right? Nietzsche was, he extolled health. His philosophy is a search for the great health, but he himself is very sick and weak. And so what does that say about Nietzsche? Especially considering that Nietzsche talks about ideals as an expression of one's lack. What one idealizes is what one does not have. And that would seem to apply to Nietzsche himself. And so you can find this critical framework to attack Nietzsche within Nietzsche's own writing. And I think Nietzsche might have even encouraged that kind of attack upon himself, because in that way, Nietzsche still wins, right? You're still using his mental structures, his philosophical structures of thought to attack him, which means he's won. But nevertheless, I mean, this is not a new sort of... So, Weininger is simply taking the same form of that argument and saying, Nietzsche, the guy who loves life, who says become who you are, be, self-affirming, self-legislating of your own values, so on and so forth. Really, that's because he hated himself. That was his ideal, because it was a compensation for what he did not have. And, I think you can make that argument, but you have to be willing to... I don't know, leave that argument open to confirmation or disconfirmation based on what Nietzsche wrote and the way his life was. And I guess I would just ask how Nietzsche's works serve the function, fulfill the desire of self-loathing. I mean, yeah, I guess you can point to some things like ecce homo, of this apparently extreme narcissism, that could sort of play into the conventional wisdom that narcissism and self-hatred are not opposites, but are sort of two sides of the same coin or something like that. But for the most part, his philosophy doesn't seem to really, Nietzsche himself is replaced as the central figure, and Zarathustra sort of becomes the central figure, who's a fictional character, who, if we take the Jungian interpretation, is sort of like the wise old man archetype. And I just think the legacy of Nietzsche truly is ideas, and it truly is like a radical new lease on life and way of looking at the world that would seem to give quite a few people, countless people, since the time of Nietzsche's writing, a new lease on life. And I don't see how that serves the function of Nietzsche's self-loathing. If you were to make that argument about like Cioran or someone like that, or Kierkegaard, or Pascal, again, I could understand that. But, Nietzsche's work, the legacy of it doesn't seem to be to glorify himself nor to denigrate himself. And I guess I'm really struggling to find like something concrete to latch onto to explain why I don't think Nietzsche is a self-loather. All I can say at the end of the day is like, I just don't get that vibe, and I don't think Weininger actually has really a good reason for his arguments. He's just kind of saying things, and, I think in accordance with his preformed opinion of who Nietzsche is. And so that's where I stand on that. Next question is simply Infamous D, and he asks 6 different questions. So they're relatively related, but we'll get through as many as we can because it's quite a lot here. I'll do them as like a rapid fire. 1, do you think the act of cutting the Bible by Jefferson has the similar intention behind it as the cutting of historical records or eradication of the language of conquered peoples? No, I don't think so. I think Jefferson was engaged in a fundamentally different project than, you talk about the eradication of language of conquered peoples. That's an attempt at like cultural genocide, right? So, that's not what Jefferson's doing. It's that there's like an offensive intention, like an aggressive intention in that. What Jefferson is doing is trying to construct a deistic, humanistic Jesus, basically. 2, how fast can you read philosophy books? Well, it depends on the book, and I guess depends on me, like how I'm feeling that day, and or that week or that month, and it really just depends on the book. There's easier books and more difficult books, and I can read fairly fast, but even that, I don't know if I can really give you. Here's the thing. I'm not actually like keeping count of how many books I read a year or whatever. I know there's like people who do that, and I think a lot of people they're like trying to like measure or compare themselves or contrast themselves with others as they engage in activities like philosophy. Like, oh, is this good? Is this normal? Am I above average or below average? My reading speed and how many philosophers I can tackle in a year. I'm going to be honest, even with the podcast, when I'm on a schedule to put out content, I just can't think about that because it ruins the enjoyment of what you're doing. So even if I really knew, because I'm struggling to think, I'm like, how fast do I finish a book? I don't know, in like a week usually, but there's longer ones where it takes me longer than that, or just more difficult material. So I don't really know, but I feel like it's not really important for me to tell all of you that because for you to enjoy and engage with philosophy, you should not be making those comparisons. 3, the biggest hole I have with Sloterdijk's argument for the primary use of language is when it comes to indigenous peoples or cultures that have hundreds of dialects. Historically, indigenous peoples knew multiple languages. What are your thoughts on peoples like this, examples like China, India, or indigenous people who are trilingual? So I guess the question would really concern Sloterdijk's claim that languages are instruments of group narcissism and that we sort of know one another by speaking the same language. I don't think that reality changes when people know multiple languages. You're talking about places like China and India. In a lot of Europe in bygone ages, if you were, a merchant in Genoa, you probably knew quite a few languages, including some Eastern languages. Early days of the American frontier, depending on where you were, you might speak a little bit of English, a little bit of French, a little bit of Spanish. Who knows? Pennsylvania Dutch, some Native American languages, who knows? I think the reality of people being bi and trilingual and so on I don't think really affects Sloterdijk's argument, because nevertheless, language does still designate in-groups, doesn't it? I mean, it's very hard to make like broad universal generalizations about this, but generally, even if you live in an area, like to this very day, if you're in, West Africa and you're in an area where there's like 3 different tribes with 3 different language groups and all sorts of dialects beneath them, generally speaking, though, you're going to know what tribe you come from, and you're going to speak with them in a certain way. I mean, we might even say, like, think about this even on the level within languages. This is really what I'm getting at. Think about it with, like, the way teenagers have words that they try and use to denote who is in our in-group, who knows our slang, our colloquialisms, and who does not. I mean, that's a thing that happens everywhere, regardless of how many languages you speak, right? Where you're using the terminology and just the way you talk to identify who is in the group. And if somebody doesn't know, the latest slang or colloquialisms, like, oh, that's how you know they're a boomer. Not literally a boomer, but you know what I mean? Like, oh, you're not one of us, right? And usually teenagers are like on the bleeding edge of creating new slang and colloquialisms, because they are always, there's so much in like teenage culture and subculture in keeping out the people who are old and uncool, the people who are like low status and too old or too young. Very discriminatory in that way, but that's how kids are. They're cliquey. They form little groups, and it's true with everything. It's true with music and music genres, where the allusions you make and the references that you make and just the way that you speak and all of these things, it signals to someone more than merely the information that you're communicating. So I think Sloterdijk's claim holds up. I don't think it really matters how many languages you speak. The language will have the function of denoting who's in the group or who's not. I think he's dead on about that. And actually, I guess it's really David Foster Wallace's idea that he's continuing. 4, is Sloterdijk referring to the philosophical narcissism? I don't believe Nietzsche is actually narcissist. Short answer is yes. I think he's using narcissist in perhaps a philosophical term. It's funny. It's like you're asking, is Nietzsche a narcissist? And the last person was asking if Nietzsche was self-loathing. And again, those could be seen as 2 sides of the same coin. But yeah, I don't get the impression that Nietzsche is really truly either one. I think he does make those statements for shock value in some sense. And I even hesitate. As soon as I say that, I'm like, do I really want to say it's for shock value? Because that implies that it's sort of like superficial and there's no sort of actual substance or meaning behind it. And that's not what I'm saying. But I think it is to signal that return to a culture of pride and self-affirmation that Nietzsche wants to sort of bring about. A turn away from the Pauline reversal that makes everything about humility and self-denigration. And it is like that when Nietzsche uses language in that way, I think if you think about the effect that will have, it's like a test, right? Some people told me about this about Bronze Age Perverts book. I think it was in the last Q&A where I was like, oh, I didn't really like just the writing style that was at the beginning. And several people were like, hey, the book actually, that's like just sort of a test at the beginning, right? Or it's like it's a filter. It's a way of filtering out people who, are put off by it and they don't want to deal with it. My response to that was like, well, I guess he filtered me right out. I'm not in a hurry to get into anyone's little club. I don't care. So, but it's funny because it's like, there you go. Again, people use those kinds of filters all the time. So language, I think, does definitely have that function. 5, do you really think that the reversal of language is still prevalent in society unconsciously? I think now more than ever, people are against religion. Not a lot of people actually believe in God. I still see the resentment from a moral demand, but not sure its source is from this resentment created from the use of metaphysics and language. I would tend to agree with Nietzsche that prior to the ascendance of Christianity, just as a matter of historical record, we don't seem to have these moral values which are based on selflessness. We could also say that this occurs with, say, Buddhism and some other religious movements that bring us into the modern age, that are, we might say, sublations or even revolutions against the pagan, right? Religions such as Stoicism, Epicureanism, Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, most major world religions that we have today that aren't just sort of, I mean, there's very few. We might say that, or rather, you could at least make an argument that a lot of Hinduism is perhaps like a holdover or like the only surviving form of the Indo-European style of religious belief that was polytheistic, which was shared to some extent with the Greeks and Romans. So there are still some examples, but for the most part, Christianity-style religions based on selflessness, pity, turning away from the worldly, or thinking that worldly ambition doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you look or what you do. It's what's inside that counts. All that matters is being a good person or being a decent person. What does being a good person or a decent person mean? It means being harmless. It means helping others, being of service to other people. I think that is pretty much the morality that dominates in modern times, regardless of whatever metaphysical or superstitious trappings people attach to it. And it does seem to come from that particular moment in time. And, you know, even if it isn't directly connected as a historical phenomenon, I think you could make an argument that it's not. You could at least say it's just like the same categories of thought that obtain today. And in some sense, it's not really important. We're just sort of recognizing a familial resemblance between modern, we might say, sort of utilitarian secular morality and apostolic Christianity, in that they have this negative character. They don't think there's anything positively that there is to win within the world. There is nothing worthwhile to do on this earth. There's nothing new under the sun. Everything falls apart. All material things fall apart. The promise of the world is always unfulfilled. Everything is always bittersweet. And so, you know, the real secret is to live in service of others. It's really a negative goal of reducing the suffering of others. And that's what our whole lives should be. And, you know, I think there is that familial resemblance. And I think, is that reversal of language still prevalent in society? I think that's sort of an open question. There's a major political figure. He's a candidate running for office in the United States presidential election right now, who speaks in a very prideful way that doesn't, partake of any of this sort of, we might say, self-lowering. And a lot of people absolutely revile that about him, but a lot of people actually like that about him. And so, you know, you could make the argument that maybe there is like a real hunger to return to the kind of, frankly, pagan use of language that Nietzsche stands for. But, and I know that's a very vulgar example that I just used, but, it's very illustrative that, you know, you can definitely see that there are types of people. I mean, a lot of, prominent like tech CEOs, they're incredibly powerful people, but they couch everything in terms of like doing good for the world and connecting people, right? It's very much of like the service that I provide and how can I do good and how can I live for others. And that doesn't mean it reflects the reality of how they actually behave and how they actually think morally. It's just that they have to speak in that language. And when somebody doesn't speak in that language, it is inherently controversial. There's some people who will be attracted to that because of the very fact that it's suppressed all the time, and we all have to keep up the Pauline reversal and keep denigrating ourselves, at least in some way, or make everything about others, right? Some people will then be very attracted when somebody breaks that rule, but inevitably, perhaps even the majority of people will be turned off by it, and I think we still see that today. And so, yeah, I think a lot of this is very much still alive. There are, I'm not going to say nobody speaks like that. I just gave an example of somebody who does, but it's usually very controversial. And so that's just the way it goes. 6, do you think the moral event of the Bible was successful purely through linguistics, or was it because they were successful in enforcing on others? Well, before the Christians had the power to enforce anything on others, they kind of spread through these memes that you could see as fundamentally a linguistic phenomenon, right? I mean, Sloterdijk would say that they changed the nature of the language game, and that's how their ideas spread. But before, the mobs of Christians, bearded men in filthy black robes, could wander the streets screaming and tearing down the statues of the pagan deities, they had to gather enough public support in order for that to be even conceivable. And that took hundreds of years. And, I think the key thing would just be to say, guys, Christianity, if you are at the bottom of the barrel, underclass, downtrodden, a slave in the Roman Empire, it's not hard to see the appeal of Christianity. It makes perfect sense. So it's not a mystery at all why it spread to me. And that Nietzsche, I think, elucidates that very clearly. I remember seeing a Christian meme that was going around where they were like, well, if Christianity is man-made, why does it go against every human desire? And Genealogy of Morals perfectly explains why. Because it's a religion for the people who are inadequate at fulfilling any of their human desires, so they turn against those desires. They've had all of those things denied to them, and they see that the people who get to fulfill those desires are the ones who are actively harming and oppressing them, so they say that all those things are evil. And there's a huge appeal to that. And I would even say that by the time the Christians start trying to enforce Christianity on others, it actually corresponds with sort of like a resurgence of master morality in some way that is fundamentally anti-Christian, taking up the symbols and the aesthetics and imagery of Christianity. And I don't think we really need to get into that much further here, but, obviously Nietzsche would say over time, over many sort of cycles, that eventually the master morality, the pagan impulses have been mostly smothered within us. But, the men doing the Crusades were the descendants of people like Clovis, who, when he heard the story of Jesus' crucifixion, gripped his axe and said, if I had been there with my valiant Franks, we would have avenged him, right? So that's not slave morality that Clovis is expressing. And it's very interesting to look at Christian reactions to that statement, because some will say, well, of course Clovis should feel that way. This was the worst crime ever committed. This is the murder of our Lord. And so his anger is justified. And others will say, well, he's completely missed the point. The point of Christianity is not to take revenge, it's to turn the other cheek. And so it's very funny how it can psychologically reveal very much about the individual Christian experiencing that anecdote, what it says about them. But that's sort of my point, that somebody like Clovis he's not the same kind of person who invented the religion. And the people who invented the religion actually didn't have the power to impose it or enforce it on Clovis. He was the one who then went and did the enforcing of their religion on others. And this is the whole story of Christianity leaving the hearts of the pure slave moralists from Rome and entering those of the hard, cruel men of the North that Nietzsche talks about a bit in The Antichrist. So no, I don't think the Bible was successful on the message of the Bible, the morality of the Bible was successful because it was enforced on others. Because the people who created the religion actually didn't have the power to enforce it on the ones who took it up most strongly. So, no, it's much more Taoist than that, my friend. The weaker force overcame the stronger. All right, Gramberger asks, have you watched or read Berserk? If not, I highly recommend. If you have, then do you believe it is a positive or negative critique of Nietzsche's philosophy? Well, the short answer is no. I have not watched or read Berserk. I will say this is one of those, this is an anime, right? Or a manga, I guess, in written form. Many people have suggested it to me. I'm not really very much into anime. Obviously, the generation I grew up in, I saw a lot of the early, iconic, anime productions, I guess. Like Akira, Ghost in the Shell, things like that. But I've never gotten into Berserk. So, let me know in the comments if you want me to talk about Berserk. I probably have no plans to do that now, but if enough people bother me about it, eventually I kind of have to do something, right? I'm a slave to the crowd. But, so no, that's probably disappointing, Gramberger, but maybe this will open up an opportunity in the comments for Berserk enjoyers to talk to one another about the Nietzschean themes, and maybe all of you who have read it can explain why you think it's a positive or negative critique of Nietzsche's philosophy. The next question is from L, and he asks, is Andrew Tate an example for master morality? Most people intuitively hate him because of his arrogance and, of course, the crimes he most likely has committed. But isn't this part of the slave moralist perspective to hate people who say, look at me, I am the greatest, I drive a Lambo and sleep with X amount of women, and am better than you all? Or is it just weakness of character to feel the constant need to prove to others how great you are? Thank you, L. I do hope you eventually apprehend Kira. That's a little joke. Actually, it's funny. Right after I said I don't really watch anime, I make a reference to an anime. So, yeah, busted, right? No, Death Note's like probably the only anime I've seen in the past 20 years. So, is Andrew Tate an example for master morality? Well, I don't think most people in the modern world really embody a pure form of either of those historical forms of morality. And I think the fact that he converted to Islam shows that where, you're sort of obliged to prostrate yourself as the slave of Allah, it definitely has elements that make it not a master morality religion. But, I realize that's a cop-out, and I'm actually going to answer your question maybe a different way than just directly answering it. I have basically the same opinion about people who love Andrew Tate as I do about people who hate Andrew Tate. I do not care about Andrew Tate, guys. I don't spend any time thinking about him, at all. I'm not bothered by him. I can read what... I think I'm just fundamentally different than most human beings because I can read things that are completely outside of, my own perspective, and I'm not, triggered by it and sitting there, seething. And I don't know. I don't have that, visceral reaction to people who even say and do things that are, so far from, the way I would behave or the beliefs or opinions that I would express, but it just doesn't bother me. And I don't know why. I guess it's because part of it is, I do really take Nietzsche's critique of free will seriously, or his assertion of the necessity of all, and that amor fati really means that saying yes to one aspect of reality, that it's all inseparable, and you can't say well, I like all these things, but I would change or fix this one part of reality. If only we could have changed this one part of the past, not realizing that you would completely alter everything in the present, that every single part of the whole is absolutely necessary. So, other human beings, I get it if somebody is personally you're attacking you or fucking you over on an individual level. It doesn't really behoove you to think this way. But if we're just talking about what I think about other personalities, everyone is who they are, and I'm not over here sitting thinking wow, what a piece of shit, or wow, what an amazing person. A great man, I only see the actor of his own ideal. When I look at a criminal, I see someone who was driven by necessity to do what they did. I just don't have that, I don't know, visceral reaction, as I said. And so the people who really love Andrew Tate, I've already said a lot of this, I've been asked this before, but the people who admire Andrew Tate tend to be people who are, Sloterdijk talks about this. Nietzsche promises to be a brand of winners, and so he's naturally appropriated by losers. Because again, idealizing something usually signifies a lack. And the people who take Nietzsche that way usually are kind of pathetic. And I'm not saying that about all Andrew Tate fans. I know there's probably plenty of you who are not losers. But I don't know too many guys out there who are successful and, as they say, locked in, doing their own thing in their own lane, enjoying their lives and accomplishing their goals, who are spending their time, voyeuristically enjoying the luxury and sexual exploits of another man. Why would I care about that? And what has Andrew Tate done that I should really be fascinated with him as a figure? He had a MMA career and he's a chess player. From what I understand, he's kind of average at both of those things. Probably better than most people. definitely better than the average person. But still, he's not like a chess grandmaster, and he's not the greatest fighter who ever lived. He's a rich guy who lives a luxurious lifestyle, and consequently ends up kind of promoting a very like hedonistic. I mean, in many ways, Andrew Tate is not actually against modern values, because he's just promoting, like, everyone's already out there just living for their own hedonistic pleasure. There's nothing within like the liberal, democratic, secular, utilitarian worldview that says that, like, if we leave all the accusations about Andrew Tate aside, which I know that's a big deal, so everyone can, sort of yell at me for that. But let's just say that he is who he appears to be, and everything he's done has been consensual, right? What would be the problem with that within like neoliberalism, within this sort of like brave new world that we live in? There's no problem with it. The only problem with Andrew Tate would be if he actually did like sex trafficking and all of those things. And that's like a legal issue that whenever people want, I'm not going to weigh in on that, because why would you ask me that? I'm not a legal expert, and that would just be me speculating blindly about something I know nothing about. Like, that's a matter for the courts. So if you just want me to talk about that kind of thing, that's a question for a different podcast. But just looking at his, like, the behavior that's absolutely beyond question, that is the real reason why people hate him, because they hated him before these accusations, right? These accusations are sort of like, what would we say? It's like the fulfillment of the negative caricature that people had of him. But I mean, ultimately, he's just sort of saying, or he's just, the image that he gave off was the person succeeding and flourishing within a hedonistic, liberal, modern world. And, a lot of people would say, yeah, that is what he's doing. He's showing you how to succeed within what's happening now. That being said, I don't really know much of what he offers of valuable advice in that respect. It's the same old thing. Like, just be confident, be strong, be tough. Don't sacrifice what you want for some, the timidity of the modern person or something like that. It's just all emphasizing sort of the masculine, and how a man with typical masculine urges can fulfill all of his hedonic desires. I'm an example of that within modernity. I mean, it's really, is he really any different from just like the female side of that, which would just be your typical Instagram or TikTok influencer who's like on OnlyFans or whatever, right? It's just the same thing. It's just people voyeuristically looking at success that they wish they had. And none of it's impressive to me. The people who impress me are people who are like incredibly skilled or incredibly driven and have done incredible things. Those are the personalities that interest me. And it's also why, like, yeah, I've compared to the average person, I've had a fairly interesting life. But whenever people want to know about me, I'm like, I haven't really, I haven't really done anything like that remarkable. I don't think I'm that interesting as a personality. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I'm being proved wrong about that. But I guess what I'm saying, for my taste, I've never been interested in Andrew Tate, because I would rather listen to somebody like, Magnus Carlsen or Zizek, or just any number of people who are like just more interesting people. What is Andrew Tate? At the end of the day, he's just a playboy who, he fascinates people for that same reason, that he affirms what he is and says, yeah, I don't care, I'm going to get what I want. And because there's so much timidity around us, people find that fascinating. I don't find it fascinating. And I think if you want to have any of the things that Andrew Tate has, you probably shouldn't be listening to Andrew Tate. There's a million way more important things you should be familiarizing yourself with. You should be learning about investment and playing the stock market. You should be learning a trade or a skill that is marketable. You should be just doing any number of things like that. Andrew Tate's not going to help you with. Andrew Tate doesn't give a fuck about you. Why would you listen to him? So, and then on the other side of the coin, the people who are obsessed with Andrew Tate and are talking about him all the time and just see him as like this horrible problem with society that needs to be fixed, they also need to get a life. And it clearly is that they are, like as you say, that's the slave moralist perspective, to hate people like him because he's violating the rules of Like I said earlier, like the tech CEO who's filthy rich and probably indulges many of the same things that Andrew Tate does, just in secret, and outwardly projects this idea of, being a moralist. That's the way that you should behave, right? And all of the people who hate Andrew Tate with this like kind of just like livid, seething, visceral hatred probably do not care about any number of people who do the same or worse things than him, like in terms of, say, again, like sex trafficking and things like of that nature, who are rich and powerful political and corporate figures, just because they might say the right things and express the correct beliefs in public. And so, yeah, as usual, both opinions are stupid, and this entire topic it's totally reactive. It's totally us looking at how is this guy perceived, and even the way you describe it, they hate people who say, "Look at me, I'm the greatest." Well, the people saying, "Look at me, I'm the greatest," who establish their greatness based on the way that others perceive them, are also being reactive, just as much as the people who spend all their time hating somebody who's achieved greatness out of their own jealousy. Just like people who are spending all their time idealizing someone who's achieved greatness for the precise reason that they don't have it. And I think, do you think Andrew Tate is out there watching influencers like himself? Does he have somebody similar to an Andrew Tate, right? Like, who is Andrew Tate's Andrew Tate that he listens to, right? He probably doesn't, guys. And so, the people who want what he has are not served by listening to him. The people who are obsessed with him are obsessed with they're misdirecting their attention, because Andrew Tate is not who holds power in society, and there are a million people who are way worse than him that you don't care about because they don't rub you the wrong way. You just don't like the vibe he gives off, including people who are sex traffickers who are way worse than him. And the real weakness of character is caring about people like Andrew Tate. Stop caring. It's not worth your time, guys. And like, I could see some people saying, like, why do you care about people like Jordan Peterson? It's like, I actually don't. Like, as a personality, I do not. Like, I'm not trying to destroy Jordan Peterson. I wish him all the best, just like I do with all of you. I don't care. He's a useful point of contrast that is illustrative, that actually is very helpful for when I'm trying to explain how Nietzsche has been oversimplified and misrepresented in the mainstream. He's the biggest offender out there right now, misrepresenting Nietzsche in the mainstream. So I use him. I'm very glad there's a Jordan Peterson out there, because he's very useful as a pedagogical tool. So no, I'm not obsessed with Jordan Peterson. And I haven't made a video where he's the main topic for years at this point. It's, so just get out of that whole thing of for and against some internet personality. It's not the occupation of thinking mind. I'll just put it like that. I have bigger things to think about. But no offense to L. I understand, to answer your question, is he an example of master morality? I mean, in some ways you could say yeah, in some ways you could say no. And ultimately, where you come down on that question and how you classify him is going to reveal more about the person and their psychology and their politics than anything about Andrew Tate. So the answer that's going to be best for you is forget about Andrew Tate. But no offense to L. Good question. Okay. Nadim Kulinovic. They ask, have you read Shame and Necessity by Bernard Williams? It might be interesting to cover it on the podcast at one point. He was one of the first big-name philosophers in the analytical tradition who seriously engaged with Nietzsche. In connection to that theme, where are you with your book on Nietzsche and the Greeks, and when can we expect it? No pressure. Well, thank you for that second question, because it allows me to give you some answer, because the answer to your first question is no, I have not read that book. I haven't read anything by Bernard Williams. Again, in the comments section, let me know if this is somebody you'd like me to cover, and sort of help me gauge the feeling of the audience. I have read very little in the analytical tradition myself. I'm not a huge fan of the analytical tradition, but I'm not like opposed to it. It's just usually I don't enjoy reading it. I'll put it like that. It's not really literature. But the second question, where am I with my book on Nietzsche and the Greeks? So I mean, it's done. It's drafted. I would say, I guess we're on a second or third draft. It's kind of hard to say. When you finish and you're like, okay, all of the content is here, usually I've already kind of been revising as I go, at least a little bit. And I've gone through and done a couple revisions, and I've tried to give it some fresh eyes, but I'm at the point of like kind of showing it around to friends at this point. And, if somebody's going to look over something for you for free, you kind of can't badger them about it. So I'm kind of in that phase where I want some fresh eyes to look at it. So maybe I will put it, or a draft of it, on the Patreon or something like that. The only problem with that is like trying to eventually get it published. Usually they don't like if you've put up the manuscript already online for other people to read. But I am looking for editors, and I do want to kind of shop this one around. And I'm in a weird position. I guess I'll just confess all of this to my podcast audience, because it's like, people like this kind of candor. My book about Nietzsche and the Greeks, I think, would fit right in with, like, frankly, a right-wing publishing house like Passage Press or Imperium Press, something of that nature. It doesn't really have a right-wing message. It's just the subject matter would, I think, go over very well with that kind of audience, because the subtitle of the book is Nietzsche's Hellenist Revolution, and it's basically about how Nietzsche uses the Greek world to revolt against the modern world. No pun intended there, reference to a very other well-known right-wing author. And I think, that would just be, within that milieu, it would fit right in with the kind of people who want to read, The Ancient City and stuff like that. And on the other hand, though, the reason why I'm very unsure about that is just fear of being siloed off. Not canceled necessarily, but I've done very well at not positioning myself on either political wing, and I really don't want to do that. Partially because I don't really want to be part of anyone's team, because I'm not. I'm a very bad team player, I'll be honest. And I don't want to alienate the people in, like a left-wing audience. And it does make you think, where you're kind of like, it does suck that I could, if I was able to get this published on, say, 0 books, I don't think that would alienate me from my right-wing audience. But if I got it published on Passage Press, it probably would get me alienated from my left-wing audience. And so, I don't know, I'm kind of at a loss of like what kind of publishing house I would want to try and approach for this book. I could also go with my existing publisher in my previous book, but it's a very different kind of thing. It's not a memoir. It's just pure, I wouldn't say philosophy. Really what I'm doing is, I guess, philology in a way, amateur philology, just as I've classified the podcast. I'm just trying to explicate Nietzsche's thoughts, and it really is like my attempt to painstakingly go through every aspect of Nietzsche's comments on the Greek culture, and everything Nietzsche had to say about the Greek philosophers. And in conclusion, we kind of talk about the Christian revaluation and the possibility of a revaluation of values in our modern times. So all of that's finished, and I've revised it a couple times, and I'm kind of at the point where I want some fresh eyes on it, and then I'm going to start shopping it around. And then at that point, it would probably be like a solid year before it came out. That's how long it takes to prepare and market these things and print them. So that's where we're at. Michael asks, have there been any attempts at creating a metaphysical Nietzschean philosophy? It seems to me Nietzsche was critical of Judeo-Christian spirituality, but could one combine his view with a different metaphysical theory, like pantheism or pan-consciousness, as long as it isn't life-denying? Short answer would be yes. I mean, some people have tried to do this. Arguably, Heidegger tries to do this. Arguably, Baumler tries to do this. Granted, that's not great company politically, many people would say. And there is a tendency of those who interpret Nietzsche metaphysically to also interpret him politically, which is a very odd connection. And I think it shows that there is a connection between metaphysical thinking with, say, ethical thinking, and political thinking is really just enforced ethics, right? So, yeah, I mean, you could combine Nietzsche with a sort of Heraclitean metaphysics or with a Taoist metaphysics. And there have been some attempts at that. And, even Nietzsche's anti-metaphysics, from a certain point of view, can be seen as itself metaphysical. Because, the statement that being is an empty fiction and there is only becoming. I mean, in a way, that dispenses with all further metaphysical speculation, but it's kind of a metaphysical statement. It's kind of inescapably a metaphysical statement. And so, you could interpret that a lot of ways. You could say, on the one hand, well, Nietzsche has to make one final metaphysical statement in order to basically do an about-face, turn away from metaphysics, and turn our attention to the phenomenal world. Or you could say that basically every metaphysician has attempted to end metaphysical speculation with their own metaphysical claims, right? Isn't that what every metaphysician wants to do, is end all future metaphysical speculation? Well, how do you do that? By solving metaphysics. And so maybe that's a way where you could interpret Nietzsche inherently metaphysically. There is a sense also in which this is just sort of like a category distinction that isn't really important. It's just purely linguistic. But if what you're getting at is, could you take some of Nietzsche's positions and actually attempt to make statements about being or essence or the noumenon or something like that? Yeah, I don't see like a reason why you couldn't do that. You could, Deleuze is another example of that difference in repetition. He said Deleuze called the work pure metaphysics, and he would say he's very influenced by Nietzsche. So there's somebody on the left who has a metaphysical interpretation. And, I get into this a little bit in that two-part episode, Nietzschean Science, viewing the will to power as sort of a physical or even metaphysical claim. So I think it's certainly possible. I guess I would ask why. Like, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to cognize the noumenon? Because you'll probably be disappointed if that's your goal. All right, next question is from Bellaquarian. They ask, is music itself limited to evoke emotions, or can music express ideas beyond the evocation of archetypal moods? I ask this question myself whenever I listen to or practice music for myself. In Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, recurring musical motifs creates the plot that the composer intended to express. Ravel's triptych, Gaspard de la Nuit, is based on the prose poems by the French poet Aloysius Bertrand, and I get the impression that Ravel meticulously followed every stanza in written word and transformed them into sounds. A very well-known orchestral work which is close to blur the line between emotional evocation and philosophy is Richard Strauss's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It directly adopts the chapter lines from the eponymous book, but Strauss doesn't follow the order Nietzsche had written and published, but rearranges the order within the logical framework of classical music and its development. But if you don't know the background of these works, is one still able to understand the abstract ideas that the composer intended to realize? Well, I mean, can anyone really answer that question? Because I guess the issue with conveying abstract ideas in music, or in any art form really, is that, like, obviously there is a point to which you could convey an abstract idea. And almost the more abstract the idea is, probably the better it can be conveyed. But the more concrete, like the more you put like the idea that you're conveying into the form of a statement or a syllogism or something like that, the harder it's going to be to demonstrate that that is what is being conveyed, other than just listening to the person tell you that that's what the music is trying to convey, right? So like, because you know that about Ravel's triptych, right? Then you get the impression that they meticulously followed every stanza and transformed them into sounds. But if you didn't know that, would you come to that same conclusion? I mean, even if you had the stanzas and the written word in front of you, would you? I mean, it's very hard to say. It would be almost impossible to make a definitive claim on that. And that's sort of Nietzsche's point when he talks about music, what would we say? The lyrics stealing the power from the music, riding the wave of the music, and the music itself evoking no images in and of itself. That when we retrospectively say, oh, this is a springtime idyll or something like that, that it sounds like the music of spring or something. that this is sort of like a representational interpretation layered on top of the music, and that, in fact, the music conveys no such imagery. That is a intermediary concern between the music and the psyche of the one experiencing it, which is why people are going to all experience different things from just the pure music. And usually the way that the meaning of the music is conveyed is in the lyrics for that very reason. The fact that the music, why have lyrics if the music itself could convey all of these ideas? It would always be sort of open to interpretation and debate. But, like an example I think I've used before, like the Oath of the Horatii. That is a painting. It's not music, but, it doesn't spell out for you what the painting is about. But, like, if someone were to bring up the abstract ideas of duty, honor, filial piety, so on and so forth, they wouldn't be wrong, right? That would be correct. And I think you could get that feeling from that painting without really knowing the background of the time period in which it was painted, nor the actual story of the Horatii. You could probably pick up on all of those things. And those aren't emotions. I mean, there might be an emotional element, but, the abstract idea of commitment to duty, it's not really an emotion. And you could get that purely just from the artistic content without having to have it spelled out for you. So I think that's certainly there. But if you want to take it to any sort of meaning beyond that, beyond just sort of like, I don't know, this is what I'll say. The way that abstract ideas are conveyed by music is on the same level of blurry resolution that emotions are conveyed. For example, you can listen to a minor musical composition and say, this is sad, or even with more subtlety say, this is like languid and melancholic, or something like that. But why is the person sad? What is the tragic or melancholic story being conveyed? Different people might write a different story in their head listening to the same piece of music, and who's to say who's right or wrong, other than by reference to what the artist's intentions were, which makes you sort of reach outside of the text, which means you're not really purely getting that from the artwork. So I think it's impossible to really reliably convey anything like a narrative or a syllogism. Like art hits you with an emotion, sadness, or a concept, duty, something like that, right? But that's not really conveying information. It's not really communicating information. It's giving you a vibe, all right? That's the purpose of music. And I think maybe part of this that I've been trying to get at is the difference between an idea and an emotion is thinner than we like to imagine, because most abstract concepts, if we're not allowed to construe them into a sentence that is conveying information, but just duty, honor, right? That's it. That's all you get. That's not information. That's not a story. That's not a statement. That is going to, just as much as it conjures like a sort of image or a conceptual notion, really, I would say a lot of the time that's the main thing that somebody's going to associate with one of those terms is a feeling. How does that make them feel? To think about duty and honor, something like that. But I don't know. I don't know if I'm doing a good job of explaining myself here, but I think, I guess the question you asked, is music itself limited to evoke emotions? It evokes a feeling or a sentiment or a vibe, which isn't strictly the same thing as just like the classical categories of emotions. It could include what we might conventionally call an idea. It's just that usually what we call an idea is very closely related to our emotions, and we can't really say anything granular or nuanced or meaningful about these ideas that are conveyed by music until we arrange them into a sentence structure that I think that translation will always be lost when it comes to pure music or pure art in some way. If it's not the art form of literature, which involves language, you're not going to be able to communicate on that level. So that would be my opinion. Michael H. asks, what is your view on the correspondence theory of truth? Should Nietzsche's "there are no facts, only interpretations" be interpreted as a total rejection of the correspondence theory, or as something more performative to explode overly metaphysical and pious explanations of reality? Surely Nietzsche would agree that it is a fact and not a matter of interpretation that the world is round and not flat, or couldn't we say that based on our interpretation of all the available data, in fact, yes, this is a fact? Could the insistence that actually we don't know what we obviously do know be a form of life denial, an insistence on some impossible otherworldly standard of truth? Well, the world is not round, it's an oblate spheroid. Sorry, that was a bit of a Reddit style response for you. But, okay, let me sort of answer the thing that I think is beneath this, that is, it really comes through in the second half of what you asked, because, yeah, okay, so no, actually, I'll directly answer you. Nietzsche does dispute the correspondence theory of truth. He doesn't believe in that, and I would as well. And it's not strictly performative, because what would it be performing other than the rejection of the correspondence theory of truth? Like, it's not just, oh, don't be so rigid. Maybe there are some facts out there, some objective facts. So what is the basis of that, right? It has really nothing to do with saying that the world isn't like, that we can't definitively say. Like, who's to say whether the world is round or flat? That's not really Nietzsche's point. He would say the fact that the world is round is not mind independent. What does that mean? It means that you have no basis for asserting that the statement "the world is round" obtains outside of the human experience of the world. And the reason for that would be every single data point that we have, you bring up data, all the available data, where is that? Well, that exists within our nervous system. That is where the data occurs. What would the world be if you take away our visual sensation of it, our ability to feel, to touch it, our, all of our sensory perception of it? If that was all gone, what would be left over, right? So outside of the appearance of what the globe is, what is it? What is the globe that doesn't appear in the sensations at all? What is that? Substance? Matter? Noumena? I mean, those are just words for saying X, whatever it is that exists outside of my perception of it. And so is that really a meaningful statement to talk about the world as it is prior to any appearance in the phenomenal world? The point is that all the data that we have is in the world of appearance. It's all in the phenomenal world. And that necessarily is bound to the level of perception that we're at. Now, does that mean that we can't measure things about the world that we don't see with the naked eye? Sure. But even when you're looking at a molecule, you're still looking at what is effectively a pixel. You're looking at something that is making a neuron fire within your brain, and then your confirmation of that is other human beings who have access to the same type of information. And so we don't ever get out of that. And so a lot of people then make the mistake of saying like, oh, well, then the appearance isn't real. But that's actually the opposite of the statement that you should take from that. That in fact, the appearance is the only thing that's real. The appearance is the only thing that we have any justification for talking about, is actually the realm of what you're talking about, the available data. So this is a really hard thing for a lot of people to get at, and it's why I kind of talk about it in the first episode. Nietzsche's position is a total rejection of the idea that there are objective facts. Because what is a fact? A fact is, again, it's a data point that we've picked up on within the phenomenal world, within the world of appearance, that multiple people have verified and corroborated. And at no point do we ever get to touching the noumenon in that formulation. That never happens. We never experience a mind-independent reality. So what is the basis for making statements about it? And I don't understand why scientists in particular seem like allergic to this kind of thinking, because they're usually the ones who are like, denigrating philosophers and like metaphysics for being completely worthless. We should just be looking at the empirical world. It's like, well, your whole correspondence theory of truth is not just the empirical world. That is necessarily a statement about what is beyond the empirical world. You're saying if there was no one there to observe it, the world would still be round, right? But what does it mean for something to be round if there's nothing to like see that shape, right? The roundness of it is as much something that we're experiencing, that if there was nothing with a sense organ that existed, it is a bit hard to talk about this, but it really is as simple as the Zen koan. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. Everyone, sort of scoffs at that in the West within the scientific mindset and says, of course it does, not realizing that they're making like a really shaky philosophical statement that is basically saying, independent of beings with sound sensing organs, sound exists. I'm not going to say the wave doesn't exist, right? Even though that would be technically, I don't think I am justified in making the statement that the wave exists independently of the sensory organ to hear it, but let's just assume it does. But what would sound be without the organ to hear the sound? I mean, really, do you have any justification for talking about sound as a phenomenon? And I just think Nietzsche's brilliance is saying that turn away from that need to say that the facts that we know are somehow independent of humanity or the human mind. Because there will never be a situation in which we have access to what is independent of the human mind. That's a contradiction in terms. You can't have knowledge of that in your mind. And so when Nietzsche's saying there are no facts, only interpretations, what he's saying is that the phenomenon is never... There's no example of a phenomenon that's independent of the observer of it and the interpreter of it. That when we talk about a sound, we're talking about the intersection of that wave with the human eardrum. And we don't have the example of Platonic pure sound that has never been heard by any ear and that exists independently of it. That's like, we always, in order to hold the correspondence theory of truth, we have to posit a world that is completely separate from us and what we are. And then sort of suggest that what is factual is by reference to that world, which we don't have access to. It makes no sense. What the correspondence theory of truth is really getting at is just common agreement, just overwhelming agreement. All of us have corroborated and seen with our sense organs that this is a fact. We all experience the same thing, therefore it's a fact. That's really what's going on. And a lot of people they're just uncomfortable with that. They want there to be solid ground to stand on. And I think that the lie of metaphysics is that it is solid ground because it's really unnecessary. Nietzsche's position is to just embrace appearance and just realize the world is what appears. Everything that we experience is in appearance. It's not, we don't need the metaphysical essence behind it. It's not a world that, we're not living in an illusory world. And so, and by the way, he writes there are no facts, only interpretations in his notes. When he publishes a statement similar to that, he says there's no moral facts, there's only moral interpretations of the facts. Now, personally, I don't think, Nietzsche, that's because Nietzsche didn't want to go too far or something like that. I think it is just that he knew people would, this is a very difficult concept to understand, and that it would have probably misled people to put that into one of his books. But, nevertheless, Nietzsche became super famous, so we have all of his notes, and his sister published The Will to Power, so we have that aphorism anyway, even though he didn't publish it, right? So, that would be my answer. The reason why we know the world is round and not flat is because a bunch of people have observed it that way, and we've all agreed that we all are having the same phenomenal experience. No one ever got beyond their own phenomenal experience to verify that in some objective world independent of human minds, the world is still round. We just simply don't have that information. But the question is, why do you need to have that objective correspondence theory of truth? Why is it so uncomfortable to admit that our truths are based on consensus? Maybe it's because we know how fallible we are. We know how often not only do our individual senses lie to us, but the group perception, the group sensory perception can lie to us. And we don't want to admit that that fallibility is there. And we want there to be some sort of like scientific approach to life that is infallible. And that's never going to happen, right? And oftentimes there's a viewpoint that presents itself as pro-science that is in fact very anti-scientific, that regards the scientific truths that we know now to be sort of beyond, like they're just on guard constantly against pseudoscience. And I know why. It's because there are people out there who think the earth is flat and who will put forward that idea. And they're so on guard against that, they're like, they take this position of like the current scientific like hypotheses as if they're dogmas or orthodoxies, which is like the opposite attitude you should take. Don't get suckered by pseudoscience, but there's no need to like cling on to this objective mind independent correspondence theory view of truth, or into like scientific dogmatism as a way of safeguarding scientific knowledge. We don't need any of that. We are far better served by being honest about the fact that we are fallible, ignorant, and all of the things we believe are subject to change and get revised every decade. And certainly, if we look back to what they believed scientifically centuries ago, we believe way different things today. And that wasn't because they were doing shoddy science. They were doing the best they could with what they had. So, I don't know if I have explained myself very well, but that's the main thing, is just get rid of this notion of objective truth entirely, and admit that you're human. That would be my take on this. Jacob Joliffe asks, fairly new to your group, could you criticize Daniel Tate's thesis in How to Read Like a Parasite, how the left got high on Nietzsche? For example, heavily contextualizing Nietzsche as a reactionary in the backdrop of the Paris Commune takeover and emphasizing the community building project. Yeah, okay, so there is a way in which Tate is actually factually wrong about this, insofar as he ties the publication of Birth of Tragedy directly to the Paris Commune as like a response to it. And not only is the philosophical position that Nietzsche takes in Birth of Tragedy really actually not the same. I would even say, especially politically, it's not the same as his later career. Even though you can see, I discussed this at length in my reading of Birth of Tragedy. There's people who will entirely dismiss it as just a different Nietzsche that has no relation to his later work, and then people who will think like that the things he says in Birth of Tragedy should be taken as on par with the philosophical positions he takes in his later work, when he is coming at it from a very different perspective. As is almost always the case, the truth is somewhere more nuanced and more in the middle than that. That being said, Nietzsche didn't write Birth of Tragedy in response to the Paris Commune. Tate is actually factually wrong about that. And the reason why we know this is because Nietzsche wrote drafts of the book before the Paris Commune even happened. And we can find early unpublished writings in his notes covering many of these ideas before the Paris Commune happened. Now, I guess to be charitable to Tate, you could say, well, is it a response to socialism? I guess this goes towards the community building point, right? Where Tate's allegation is that the socialists are doing a kind of community building and raising the class consciousness of the proletarians. Let's get all the proletarians on the same level, on the same community of socialists, and then this heightening or raising of the class consciousness and this binding together of the proletarians will then create the conditions for a revolution. Whereas Nietzsche's community building project is sort of getting the aristocrats together, or even people who are not aristocratic themselves, or who might have sympathies to the current hierarchy. Basically people who agree with the current hierarchy. Basically reactionaries, right? And get them to build a community, and so they'll then oppose the coming of socialism. And, I think there is a community building project insofar. See, I would never use those terms, though, because this is where I might sound like somebody like Otto Weininger, where I take a more psychological approach to Nietzsche's doing, or to what Nietzsche is doing in like trying to gather up his free spirits or herald the philosophers of the future, sort of reach out across time to those who would be his friends. Nietzsche is creating some imaginary friends for himself. In a way, it's a very common sort of literary exercise. It's an exercise in creating fictions in order to deal with the reality that Nietzsche simply felt that there was no one around him who really understood him or who shared his ideas or saw the truths that he saw, or whatever we want to say. These are imaginary friends. I don't know that Nietzsche actually, again, this is something I can't prove. It's just sort of like my feeling, but I don't think Nietzsche actually cared about building a community beyond like the idea of a sort of Epicurean philosophical community, the idea that he had with Paul Ray and Lou Salome of starting a philosophical commune, which is kind of funny, right? That a philosophical commune, and Tate sees Nietzsche as responding to the Paris Commune, but this would obviously be like this would be like a reactionary commune, right? Because they would be apolitical, they'd be depoliticized, and they would be probably privileged in some way, and withdrawing from the masses, the rabble, so that they can sort of just enjoy themselves in serene philosophical contemplation or something of that nature. To the extent that Nietzsche has a community building project, it's again in that vein, but that's also, again, that's sort of another imaginary thing, right? Because that never happened. Nietzsche had a serious falling out with both of them, and he never gets to go establish his philosophical commune. So I really don't, again, I'm going to say it again. It's going to become a cliche on this channel. Nietzsche doesn't care about the polis. Nietzsche, I don't think, cares about one political order or another rising or falling. His fear is on the level of values, on the level of like transnational, even trans-civilizational in a way, values that color our entire experience of life in the world. And I don't think that Nietzsche honestly believed that there was anything that could be done about socialism in his time and place. I think he believed that socialism would sort of rise up as a cataclysmic event, as a terrible event, and would destroy the existing political order, and then something new would rise up in its place. And his hope is that this will be, the degenerative nature of that process could be reversed, and maybe it could become a hypertrophic process instead of an atrophic process, if that makes sense, or entropic process. So that would be my answer. I think Tate is very concerned about the political, and he hones in on the political aspects of Nietzsche. And I think maybe to again be charitable to Tate, what he's seeing, like he's responding to something very specific, right? So like if you're not on the left and you're not like a left-wing intellectual, Daniel Tate's critique, and this is why I think I realized this maybe like after I talked to him and some of the questions I was asking, like some of the people were very frustrated in the comments with the way Tate was responding to my questions. Like, oh, Salts asked him like the same question 3 times and he was evading. And me and him kind of talked in DMs after the fact. And he kind of, because I was kind of asking him like, okay, but is an actual egalitarian society actually achievable? Like, where do you stand on that? And he was basically making the argument like, that's sort of like a Platonic ideal of equality, or it's like a Kantian ideal of equality. And that basically like Marxists don't actually really believe in that. That's like a utopic, basically. That it's like an endless dialectic in that direction, but you never like fully manifest equality on Earth. That would mean that you've solved all problems and there's nowhere for things to go, right? That there's always, it's a perpetual revolution, a permanent revolution, right? And yeah, you kind of have to understand those aspects of Marxism. If you're outside of that whole thinking, though, to kind of circle back to like, I think my fundamental difference with Tate's not really going to make sense to you, or his critiques aren't going to be really relevant to you. You can kind of like take them or leave them, right? Because really what he's going after are like the Foucauldians and the Deleuzians and Adornoites, I don't know, all the left-wing intellectuals who were influenced by Nietzsche, who thereby introduced a sort of, maybe consciously or unconsciously, a more individualistic like there is something in Nietzsche that is inherently anti-revolutionary. Like he's right about that. I think, as I said, he's factually wrong about Nietzsche's response to the Paris Commune, I think. And I think the community building project is something that is his interpretation he's imposing on the text in accord with the way he thinks and what's important to him. But he is responding to like the fact that like, yeah, an anti-revolutionary thinker got into left-wing thought. And I think, on the other side of that debate, there are people like Devin Gore who would say, yeah, well, Nietzsche's, sure, he's not a revolutionary thinker in the Marxist sense, but like we absolutely have to integrate Nietzsche because of the truths that he speaks that we have to deal with, which I think is also a very mature perspective. But it's not to say Tut's position is immature. I think he's warning the left that like, I mean, as he said in the conversation with me, like, if this is like a car and we're driving towards the Marxist revolution, like Nietzsche can be on the bus, but he shouldn't be driving the bus, right? Because he ultimately at the end of the day is not for your socialist revolution. And, that's my bigger problem with people like Jonas Cheka, who tries to say, no, Nietzsche is 100% compatible with Marxism, or whatever differences he may have are negligible, and we can completely integrate these two. I think that's, out of the three, that's like the wrongest approach. Because the thing that Tut is right about is that, yeah, Nietzsche is not for your revolution. And if you really take Nietzsche seriously, I think for reasons that are not themselves political, but if you take Nietzscheanism through to its ultimate conclusions, the end will be something that is what Marxists would call reactionary, insofar as you would conclude that there are certain oppressive, tyrannical, exploitative aspects of life that, like, it's a fool's errand to try and fix, and if you actually could succeed, which is an open question, you would turn humanity into something worse, right? So, maybe an example would be people have a bias that's pro-attractive people. One of the most important things for your life is how attractive you are. Now, are there things you can do about that? Yeah, you can clean yourself up, present yourself well, have a good handshake if you're a guy, or dress well if you're a woman. I don't know, you know what I'm saying. Everyone is on the same page. But is there an element that's just your genetics? Yeah. And doesn't just come down to finding mates. It comes down to like the way you might be treated at the store, right? The way you'll be treated if you randomly approach somebody that you don't know and start talking to them. You're going to have a very different reaction if you're incredibly attractive versus if you're incredibly ugly. And this doesn't even apply just strictly to people of the opposite sex, like people you're attracted to. This bias will even come out like with people that you have that are of the same sex as you. Just like they're more attractive and they therefore get more credence, more attention, more regard, right? And more charity toward them. Like we're more charitable toward their intentions and their needs and things like that. And so, like, what is that? Because, there are, like, most people in the modern world would say that, like, hierarchies according to one's genetics are wrong. That's, like, anathema to the entire liberal project. This is supposed to be, like, a system based on merit, based on, like, how hard you work and how good of a person you are. And everything's supposed to be sort of, like, just and fair. But if we're making these subconscious decisions to benefit people based on how attractive they are, that's more hierarchical and, frankly, it's eugenicist, right? And so what do you do about that issue that everyone's expressing these liberal values, but practically speaking, oftentimes without even realizing it, we act like eugenicists? Well, is that like a problem that needs to be fixed? Look at the breeding males versus the non-breeding males among species of animals that maintain where like one male gains a huge harem and then the other one's just sort of like on their own roughing it, right? The successful males are just more beautiful. They're more physically fit, right? So you could say like the fact that we still do that and like give more regard to more attractive people within society is a reflection or an objectification of that instinct to, benefit or privilege the attractive. And like Nietzsche's position would basically be like, yeah, that's like not a problem to be fixed. That's just how nature goes. That's just the way it goes, right? And so you can recognize that truth and not say like, well, this is such a fatal problem that I have to therefore condemn all of nature and condemn all of humanity for acting this way. That's sort of the problem with Nietzsche from the Marxist perspective, though, because their perspective would be, no, we do need to fix that problem. Like, we need to make everyone stop being preferential towards the people who are more attractive. Well, how do we do that? Well, make it so that no one is attractive. Like, beauty standards themselves are oppressive, and so you shouldn't hold them. Now, the funny thing about that is, like, you can get everyone to express that idea. It doesn't change the underlying reality one jot. But, there are people out there who probably do earnestly believe, yeah, we can abolish beauty standards. We can abolish preference according to attractiveness. And it's funny, I'm sure many of those people, some of them probably take up a preference for the ugly as a performative, like, attack on the natural urge, right, to prefer the attractive or the beautiful. It's like a performative attack upon it. But I think most of them are probably going to be, they're going to emulate the same behaviors anyway. I mean, like, if you look at like the top like left-wing and socialist streamers, so, not all of them, but most of them are like, like Hassan Piker's got a good bone structure. He's a fairly attractive guy, right? So why is that? Why isn't some schlub like with, a very unconventional appearance like the number one Marxist streamer? I mean, and again, this is like old hat, or this is sort of like just a conventional style criticism. He's also like a champagne socialist who lives in a mansion, right? He's like a millionaire. Why is this successful, attractive millionaire the symbol of socialist streamers? It's almost like they just continue to replicate these same hierarchical, oppressive, exploitative, tyrannical patterns of nature in their own behavior, but then they have like a morality that is opposed to that. So, how important really is the morality for actually changing that behavior? Well, I mean, I guess the Nietzschean argument would be all that really does is put you in a perpetual state of guilt and self-loathing. So that takes us pretty far afield. But I think, so again, Daniel Tutt's correct. If you really onboard the Nietzschean attitude towards things like hierarchy, exploitation, so on and so forth, you would be forced to conclude, well, Nietzsche's anti-revolutionary. He accepts these as facts of life. That doesn't mean he's like frothing at the mouth fascist who's trying to instate these things, although you could certainly read Nietzsche that way. I personally would say that Nietzsche believes that essentially states are established under that tyrannical mode of being, modus vivendi, the barbarian way of life, which is always like that, which is always patterned according to those natural tyrannies. And over time, society becomes more and more egalitarian until it collapses. And that's just another thing that's like the way it goes. And you can rage against that, or you can say it's amazing. But I don't think Nietzsche thought that you can really change that. And so that's a very destructive ideology for people who agree with Marx that the point of philosophy is to change history. Because Nietzsche would say, okay, good luck. You can't really. You have to focus on the story of your own life. So, thoughts like the eternal return of the same and amor fati, they are anti-revolutionary thoughts. And again, I don't think that's because Nietzsche is consciously aimed at being an anti-revolutionary. I would say he just thinks the socialists are just wrong. Like they're just incorrect about human nature. All right, let's move on. Marcus R. asks, a common theme I see from people rejecting Nietzsche's quotes and aphorisms online is that he is just a teenage edgelord type of guy, which I think is just wrong and ignorant, although some tongue-in-cheek is always fun. This seems to be a common perception of his readers, to be edgy. However, that's not my experience. Maybe not being on Reddit helps. How common among his readers do you think the edgy teenagers are? I have to say that Nietzsche originally caught my eye because of Jordan Peterson's lectures, where he seemed to be a nihilist. I have since washed away my sin from those previous understandings of him, and most of J. Peterson for that matter. Okay, how common among his readers do you think the edgy teenagers are? I mean, I think most people probably when they're teenagers dabble in Nietzsche. It's almost like a rite of passage, right? Do they understand Nietzsche? Probably no. I mean, that's, again, like it's very hard. These are very speculative questions about getting into people's like minds or like how many edgy people are there out there. I think it's just a very common phenomenon that has been noted that Nietzsche is such a good writer and he's so exciting and transgressive that like he appeals to the edgy teenager. He appeals to a lot of the types of people that are easy to make fun of or, it's just such a stereotype that they'll go in and get like a half-baked understanding of Nietzsche and then start spouting off his ideas that they know. Like he also writes aphoristically, right? So Nietzsche can give us a sentence like that, live dangerously, build on your temple on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. That which does not kill me makes me stronger. How many pop stars have put what doesn't kill me makes me stronger? How many of them have put that into their lyrics? Do you think any of those people understand Nietzsche? I mean, maybe some of them do, but my point is like he gives us these aphoristic statements that somebody can take that sometimes they can sound really transgressive or really cool or really dangerous, edgy, and they can spout that off without having to understand his broader philosophy. And this can even happen with Nietzsche's critics. I mean, it's almost like when somebody's criticizing Nietzsche for being a misogynist and they bring up the whip line from Zarathustra, it's like, okay, yeah, never heard that one before, right? It's like, it's to me that's what's going on. Is they're just grabbing. Nietzsche makes it very easy for you to grab one or two sayings or phrases and repeat them for shock value. And maybe that's what he wanted. Maybe he wanted his work to, like as he said, I would rather not become holy, I'd rather become a clown. Maybe giving some maxims and arrows to the plebs to launch at one another was his idea of humor that, I don't know, we could speculate endlessly about it. I think that, again, this whole concern with how Nietzsche is perceived is something you should let go of as completely as you can. Because most of the people who will say that about Nietzsche, I mean, they fall into a couple types. They're either the type of person who they also have never read Nietzsche, and they've only experienced him through edgy people repeating his statements. And yeah, if I was that person, I'd probably think the same thing about Nietzsche myself. But who cares about their opinion? They've never really read him. And then there are people who are like the deep philosophy nerds. A lot of those people don't like popular philosophers because it's a shibboleth. It's a way of separating yourself from the dabblers or the pseuds. If you can talk about Althusser and Fichte, you like Nietzsche? Okay. Right? A meme just went around, like a green text meme of somebody talking about reading Plato on the subway and how they were struggling with it. And then a dude on the subway says, hey, like, are you an intellectual? And he says, not really. And he says, well, that's why you're reading Plato. And it's like, there's a lot of levels to that joke, I guess, or like ways you could interpret it. But I would just say like, to me, like that kind of behavior is not impressive at all. It's basically just somebody trying to one-up you, trying to flex on you, which means that they read philosophy as part of this like social competition, which is inherently reactive. And it really has nothing to do with like getting enjoyment or getting insight or wisdom for your life out of philosophy. Like I don't talk about this a whole lot, but like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, right? Those are a huge thing with online sort of Stoics. And a lot of people don't like Stoicism. Stoicism's getting a bad rap because it's all the pseuds are flocking to Stoicism. That doesn't mean that Marcus Aurelius's Meditations have like lost their value. They're still a fine source of wisdom. And the fact that they're accessible to the average person, here's what it is, man. Here's what it really is. It's jealousy for a lot of people. because it's the same reason why a lot of musicians hate pop music and denigrate pop music. And, it's not everyone can make something that everyone enjoys or that a lot of people enjoy, right? It's, in some sense, it's easier to make, like I'm going to make a really abrasive sludge metal track that's like 12 minutes of punishing riffs and screaming. And when 99% of planet Earth hates it, I say, they just don't like being challenged by my art. Maybe that's true. Like, and by the way, a lot of people who make that kind of music, it is because like that is what they love to do. And that's what they want to do. And they find other people who enjoy it, and that's what they enjoy. Great. It's the people who then turn around and say like, but, Billie Eilish sucks, Taylor Swift sucks. Like this hatred towards the people who are really good at producing something that is liked by everyone. And I think it's like there's an awareness that like you actually couldn't do that if you tried. They'd be like, oh, well, all the song structures are so simple. The melodies are so simple. I work with a sound engineer. I was at his house yesterday, in fact, finalizing mixes for the new Slumbering Sun record. And he's talked about in the past, working with vocalists, pop vocalists will come in. Mixing a pop record is a painstaking process. So much technique and, frankly, artistry goes into it. And, these young women will come in and say, make me sound like Adele. And he's like, and I don't think I realized how good of a singer Adele is until I listened to all these people who are not bad singers. They're great singers. They say, make me sound like Adele. And he's like, I can do some of the things that they do on her records to produce her voice, but I can't make you sound like Adele because you're not Adele. Because very few people have the ability to sing like she does. And there are ways in which like an expert or a master of a given craft is better in ways the average person can't even perceive, like consciously. Maybe their brain perceives it on some unconscious level of like little flourishes or nuances to their performance. Things that they have to do or think about or with their body and their diaphragm. It's just endless. Like the level of craft that can go into what is, for all intents and purposes, people would denigrate, like people who are like, think they're a true artist to be like, that's just a vapid pop song. That's like, could you make that? And I think the answer for many people is no. And so Nietzsche gives us these really quotable aphorisms. There are countless. There's like, some philosophers have like one famous quote, and Nietzsche has at least 20 or 30, maybe 100 famous quotes, depending on, how famous the quote has to be a really famous quote. And same with Marcus Aurelius. Like, they found ways to communicate these powerful insights and wisdom in a way that like anyone can pick up and immediately get it. And a lot of philosophers don't like that because they're actually doing it. They actually want to speak a language that's an instrument of group narcissism. They actually want to use philosophical language as a way to exclude other people and be in a certain club. And hey, there's a great irony in what I'm saying, given Nietzsche's elitist aristocratic position. And there are ways in which Nietzsche, as we've said, kind of in answering this question, will make himself hard to understand, as he admits, kind of mislead people almost, as to what maybe his total project is, so that you don't get the whole thing on a first glance, or that he'll start out in an aphorism or like in a section saying apparently one thing and kind of have a turn where he flips the script on you. He does that often. So I'm not saying like you can get everything out of Nietzsche from just reading the epigrams and aphorisms section of Beyond Good and Evil. But I am saying the fact that Nietzsche wrote in that way makes him really accessible, paradoxically so. And that bothers a lot of people because that's not why they're doing philosophy. They're not actually doing philosophy in order to do philosophy. They're doing it as a form of social competition. And for myself, I have no time for those people. And I guess the third type of people who call Nietzsche it's just all edgelords. Nietzsche's an edgelord, his fans are edgelords. A lot of those people have like a politics that leads them to oppose Nietzsche. So that's why. But don't concern yourself with any of this, is my final answer. Okay, Meg asks, are you familiar with the recent findings on childhood trauma and how it affects the developing brain? It seems to me that Nietzsche had significant childhood trauma, death of his father, brother, relationship with his mother and sister. Along with his own intelligence, he had fertile territory to explore timeless philosophical issues. Can we take a modern-day look at him? Perhaps the trauma specialist Bessel van der Kolk, Nietzsche's philosophy on free will, crime, and punishment, just to name one area so relevant today. I'm not familiar with van der Kolk. That's another one. Maybe let me know in the comments if you're familiar with this writer. I'm assuming he's a writer or psychologist or something. I see trauma specialist, but I never heard of him. I mean, who was it who said, which psychoanalyst that, like, you know, by the time we're like, I mean, I guess this is like a Freudian insight, but like by the time we're done with childhood, we've had like a lifetime of, like traumatic experience to like fill books with, right? You don't need any additional material to make art or write about your life than, after I guess Gabor Mate is also very much into the whole childhood trauma thing. I'm kind of neutral about that. I think there are some people, I guess, who are overly obsessed with trauma these days, but I just never want to fall into the opposite of being like, oh, well, that's not real at all. Right? Like, it's totally irrelevant what happened to you in childhood. I don't think that's true. There are some things to me that happened in childhood, not necessarily like traumatic, but certain memories and experiences that are like formative. And if you have some things that are traumatic, then that's probably going to be formative too. And so if we look at Nietzsche, I mean, yeah, I think it's quite clear that the trauma of the death of his father, and probably, see, that's the thing, is like, I don't tend to think about this in terms of like, maybe this is the issue people have with like the whole trauma thing, is that it makes it as like this sort of like indelible emotional impression that like you're sort of like constantly being dragged back to being a weeping child and you can never get over it or something like that. I more just see it that like Nietzsche had the experience of seeing his father die, seeing his little brother die, and then like in adulthood, as you become intelligent enough and mature enough to process that and deal with it, there are many ways people might respond, and he responds by, like, he is responding to that event, but the response is his realization that life is precious and finite. You can be shaken free of this mortal coil at any moment. There's no guarantee, I'm 35, I've got at least 35 years left. No, you don't. You have no idea when you're going to die. And a lot of pre-modern cultures are very clued into this. And for modern people, where we kind of avoid death and have made our whole society oriented around self-preservation, I think we just deny that, or we live in sort of willful ignorance of that truth, of the sword of Damocles hanging over all of our heads at all times. What Montaigne talked about, the imminence of death at every moment, to be prepared to meet death at every moment, and then you'll never be surprised by it. That's kind of like a lost feeling that maybe Nietzsche, I think, was actually very positive for him. He turned that traumatic experience into something positive. So I do see like the effect of that on his life, things that happened in his childhood, shaping the whole course of his life. But I'll have to look into Bessel van der Kolk. And thank you for the question. It's not really in my wheelhouse, and it's kind of speculative from my end. But I think there might be something to this. Michael Maza asks, related to Karen Cox's question, what value is there in reading multiple translations of Nietzsche for the average reader? For example, I have Hollingdale's translation of Untimely Meditations, and I've been wondering about getting my hands on a Kaufman translation, but I'm not sure how different it would actually be. It really depends on the passage and the book. With Zarathustra, for example, a lot of the translations are very different. Like Thomas Common's translation is wildly different from Hollingdale's or Kaufman's. With others, like a lot of people criticized Helen Zimmerman's translations, but when I compared and contrasted like Beyond Good and Evil in her translation versus Kaufman's, it's actually very similar in many ways. I am a big fan of if you're not going to learn German and you're serious about like studying Nietzsche, autodidactically or whatever, then yeah, reading multiple translations, I would say, is actually a must. It's because that's really the only way that you're going to, I mean, you can learn sort of like, I'm trying to think of like a way to describe this, of like, I don't speak German, I don't know German, but I've learned a lot of German philosophical concepts, and then just ordinary German words that I've learned, because German has a lot of like compound words where you just kind of like shove 2 or 3 words together. And when you know what each of those compound parts means, sometimes reading the original term in German brings out something interesting about like what, say, Nietzsche is saying that a translation might not, because they're translating it into an English word that doesn't have those same connotations from like being assembled from 3 different words, if that makes sense. And so like you can kind of do that, right? But overall, probably one of the best ways is to like, yeah, read different translations and then like compare them at times, especially if like when you're not really understanding a passage that of Nietzsche's that you're reading in translation. One of the ways that you can help yourself, even before you go to me or any other interpreter, is just read a couple different translations. And oftentimes you'll see like a different potential, like a different synonym that's used for a word that brings out maybe something different. And so I would say it's essential. But I can't really speak to like any specific text or passage that it's essential for. I would just say, and it's not essential. Like if you haven't read a book by Nietzsche and you're listening to this and you want to get into it, don't think about any of this. Just pick up a book and read it. Like people really psych themselves out about this kind of thing. And I feel like that's been the theme with a lot of these questions. Like a lot of these concerns that are just like completely outside of what you're actually doing and like what you actually want out of life and what gives you enjoyment and fulfillment. And these concerns that people have. So like when they start reading, they'll be like, well, before I read Nietzsche, I want to read like all of these secondary sources and get multiple translations. And I want to make sure that I'm like, should I learn German? And like, should I make sure to read all of these pre-reading before I read Nietzsche? Do I have to read Schopenhauer and Hegel and Aristotle? And what did Heidegger say? His students had to study Aristotle for 15 years before they could study Nietzsche. I think that's all absurd. Just sit down and open the pages of the book, and you'll know whether it's for you or if it's not. And when you want to go deeper, then you start comparing and contrasting translations and reading secondary sources. So I don't want to get anyone under the impression they have to, from the start, from the jump, be reading multiple translations, like as they try to read the work for the first time. It's more that as you revisit the work, go pick up a secondary translation and start to compare and contrast, and you'll get more out of it. And again, if you're not going to learn German, it's pretty much essential to do this. Okay, Poludnica, I believe is pronounced. The L has a strike through it, so I'm guessing this is somebody from the Balkans. They ask, what would be a role of consciousness in Nietzsche's healthy individual? Or that individual wouldn't have no consciousness at all? The second part of this question is a bit unclear to me. I guess I'll just answer the first one. What would be the role of consciousness? Well, I mean, we are conscious beings. So it's kind of like asking, like, what would be the role of the bloodstream in a healthy individual? Well, hopefully it would fulfill its function, right, within the physiology. So what's the function of consciousness? The function of consciousness is to remember things and retain a sense of self. Now, the person who can't forget at all, right, that's a real problem that Nietzsche talks about. But in the healthy individual, it would sort of be, consciousness would give you a sense of yourself and a continuity of self, while discarding all of those impressions and, what would we say, just excitations, stimulus of the psyche that one experiences that create reactive, negative, I'm just trying to think of an overall word. I mean, guilt, bad conscience, ressentiment, all of these things. That is the great fault of consciousness, right? So the role of consciousness in Nietzsche's healthy individual would be a consciousness without those things. A consciousness that is solely concerned with I mean, there's a great Alan Watts I can't remember the exact quotation, but what he's talking about is that, the great joy of conscious sentient life is to be happy and to know that you're happy, right? And we can imagine the opposite really easily. Like, people who get really anxious and depressed, they kind of spiral into like, I'm sad, and I'm sad because I know that I'm sad. It's like an extra level where you're like layering suffering on top of suffering. You know that you're like not living up to your potential or not living your life in the best possible way. And so it makes you even sadder because of your sadness, something like of that nature. But to be happy and know that you're happy, right? Because we might imagine, like, for an animal that where every sense impression, nothing's retained, and they're just sort of living in an eternal moment. Whether or not this is actually how animals are, maybe some of them retain some sense of self, but the way Nietzsche describes it, and say on Truth and Lies, or not, sorry, on the use and abuse of history for life, just the ruminating cow that retains nothing, retains no sense impressions, retains no sense of self. Such a being might experience a moment of quote-unquote happiness or a moment of quote-unquote sadness, but it's a fundamentally different thing. It's like a temporary excitation of the psyche, something of that nature. It's fleeting. It's not attached to anything. It's the same as, like, an animal feeling pain or an animal feeling pleasure. That doesn't mean it retains anything or understands this as part of a continuity of its being, right? And so, even though, like, we could call it happiness when the cow finds an open field and there's no predators around and it can just graze in the warm sun, it's happy. But it doesn't then have an awareness of, like, who I am and what I am doing, and that I am this being occupying space and time at this moment, having the experience of happiness. There's like a sense. It's very difficult to find the language to talk about this, but there's a sense in which it's not truly what we mean by happiness unless you're also able to be aware of that I am the being that is happy. I, this thing with a continuity, am experiencing happiness. And so the great promise of consciousness is that it gives us that. It's the golden laughter of Nietzsche, the great joy that we can experience that could justify our entire lives. But the healthy individual basically would be free of all of the faults of consciousness. As Deleuze says, he's using health not in the sense of ordinary or normal, but in the sense of, like, normative or ideal. So it may be the case that there's never been a consciousness that's been fully free of ressentiment and the bad conscience. Yeah. But I think that is Nietzsche's conception of it. Gutso Pink asks, Nietzsche seems to believe that there is a kind of pattern or life cycle in regards to the rise, fall, and rebirth of civilizations. Do you think he regards particular parts of the life cycle as being of higher value? Do you agree with his thoughts on this topic? I mean, Nietzsche's the philosopher of youth, right? I think he clearly shows a preference for the barbaric, for the younger civilizations. I think what is often overlooked is the ways in which Nietzsche is an advocate for the autumn and winter of culture, in which he points out how these are necessary and how there are beautiful aspects to these. And, in that way, maybe Nietzsche is sort of like Cornaro, right? That coming out of the Middle Ages, everyone thought old age is just a horrible time. It's a time of sickness and frailty. The only thing you have to look forward to is death, because then you get to have a perfect body in heaven. And Cornaro comes along and says, I've lived a long time, and the most beautiful part of life is the end of life, where you get to sort of survey and reflect everything you've done, and you have the wisdom of your years, and you have greater appreciation for every moment, and something like that. That Nietzsche has those moments, right, where he is. It's funny, I'm using Cornaro because Nietzsche criticizes Cornaro in his Four Great Errors passage, but that's not really the aspect of Cornaro that I'm talking about. Just the fact that he extolled the great value or the great beauty of old age, and sort of changed people's opinions on that. And because quite a few people would say that today, right? There are people who will talk about how much it sucks getting old, but there are quite a few people who will say, hey, there's a great sort of, I don't know, there's a kind of joy in old age that is maybe a more refined or rarefied kind of experience of joy than the young people have. So Nietzsche does bring that up, and he does see it all as necessary. And I think, okay, so on a moral level or on a normative level, Nietzsche takes no position, because that would be like, I want the sapling, but I don't want the tree to, I want youth without old age. I want to grow up without growing old. It doesn't really make sense, and it's kind of another desire to fix the problems with life. And I guess, in a way, I'm just kind of expressing the biblical wisdom that there's a time to live, a time to die. There's a season for all things in life. And I think Nietzsche's very mature about that, and I think he's very much on that level. I think, though, as I said, Nietzsche is the great philosopher of youth because he's a philosopher of vitality and energy and virility in some ways. And he sees that occurs in youth and wanes as you get older, and the same thing seems to happen on a civilizational level. And, I think a mature balancing would be that, or what's a good way to talk about this? I'm not going to say, this is me personally speaking here, that when you're in your old age, you shouldn't read Schopenhauer or the New Testament or the Tao Te Ching or, the Diamond Sutra or something like that. These metaphysical and frankly otherworldly or just world-denying or life-denying philosophies are appropriate for people who are nearing the end of life. And there is a great maturity to that as well, to realizing that certain ideas they're not universally appropriate for everyone. And so reading Nietzsche when you're 97 years old and everyone you've known and loved is dead is probably not going to be that invigorating of an experience for you, because what's there to invigorate, right? But so the Chinese had a very mature approach to this, because with Taoism, for example, the conventional wisdom is that Taoism is a religion for older people. Yes, you can sort of adopt, or I shouldn't even say the Taoist religion. Really, I mean Tao philosophy, and really by that I mean Lao Tzu, Li Tzu, Zhuangzi. That's related to the Taoist religion, but the term Taoism is kind of a misnomer. So that's what I'm talking about, is that sort of the Tao philosophy. That is more appropriate for older people because, in a way, it turns you against wishing to act in the world, change the world, do things ambitiously, selfishly in the world, which is what you need to be doing when you're young if we're going to, continue the species and build empires and blah, 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 right? And so I would say Nietzsche is the philosopher who... The problem is that in the West, we had basically become so absorbed with this otherworldism, which is the ideology, the philosophy, the religion of the old, the infirm, the sick, the dying, the weak, the frail. So that's the totality of everything we're fixating on is this prepare to go to the other world and die serenely and go on your way to paradise. That is completely hostile to the young man's ideology of, no, go out, get hurt, live dangerously, do all the things, experience life. Don't take no thought for the morrow and enjoy yourself and enjoy and immerse yourself in the world now. Nietzsche's basically for my personal opinion, he stands for that philosophy of youth. And a great example of the philosophy of old age, which ironically is written when he's 26 years old, but he continues it throughout his life, is Schopenhauer, right? So read Nietzsche when you're young, read Schopenhauer when you're old, and Nietzsche definitely would be more valuable to the young, vigorous civilization. But he also, he provides valuable insights for the person living in the civilization in decline, because he's very clear-eyed and hard-nosed about what that means, and importantly about the inevitability of it, the fact that you can't save it by instituting a program of social conservatism or something like that. That will not reverse decadence, and you can't reverse decadence. And so, does youth have higher value for Nietzsche? Does the young civilization have higher value for Nietzsche? I mean, if we just see it in terms of life force and then slow depletion, then yeah, there's more life force there. That doesn't mean you get to escape the depletion, or that Nietzsche like rages against the depletion of the life energy as if it's something you can rage against. I think you see what I'm getting at here. Like he's the advocate for youth and for, the young barbaric state, the young barbaric culture, we might say. But he understands that. He has a mature understanding, I think, of that this is a season. It's not something you establish. Like Nietzsche's not for your 1,000-year Reich. You're never going to have that. You're going to, whatever kind of state you establish will eventually be done in, because you don't get to live forever. Sorry. Okay, Connor ORT asks, what was the most interesting / unique venue you've played in? Wow. That's kind of tough to answer. So we played at a sushi restaurant called Koto in Salem, Massachusetts. That was an amazing show. I don't know if that's the weirdest place I've played in. It was weird because they said it was the first doom metal show in Salem. This is back in 2015. And, I get the impression Salem, it's kind of a tourist trap, witchy place, a lot of metaphysical shops and, torture museums and things like that. And the venues, it's like bar and grill type things, you have people out there playing country and folk music and cover bands. It's not really a metal scene. But there's a lot it's not that far from Boston. There's a lot of people in Massachusetts, and everything's so close to everything else in the East Coast and the Upper East Coast. So a lot of people showed up, actually, and it was kind of terrifying showing up there, because it's like, wow, this is literally just a sushi restaurant. But around like 9 p.m. or whatever, the normal patrons started kind of filtering out, and the metalheads started showing up, and by the time we were playing, it was packed. It was great. It was an amazing experience. And so that was a very strange venue to play a metal show in, because, there's like these like paper lanterns and fountains and little like lion statues and koi fish and people eating California rolls. But we've played, so restaurant, I've played in like that place. We've played in a Chinese restaurant / venue. We've played in a Mexican restaurant / venue. We've played in strip clubs or clubs with dancers. As far as DIY spots goes, I've played in basements, libraries, record stores. There's a place called the Firehouse I believe in Birmingham, Alabama, that is actually a repurposed old firehouse. There was a place called the Doctor's Office in Houston that was quite literally a doctor's office, and then was purchased and turned into a DIY spot. And that was quite unusual. Also, Super Happy Funland in Houston is a very unusual venue. You can probably look up some information about that. Basically just a giant warehouse with all sorts of creepy clown stuff and weird toys and very weird people who run it. Like movie theater seating. That amount of space, too, like you're in a movie theater, basically. I've played in quite a few weird places. Probably my favorite was performing in the woods, in the forest, and for Shadow Woods Fest. Just as far as unconventional venues, playing in the forest is probably one of my favorite things. We also we did a generator show out in the middle of nowhere in California in the forest, which was a bit, it was unusual as well. We'll just leave it at that. So I'm not sure what the most interesting or most unique is. There was a great place last Destroyer tour called Realms, which was an arcade, like huge pinball arcade, and then also just all these arcade games, and then they'd have bands play there, and they also had a little bar. That's like the most recent one that was kind of like an interesting, unique concept, and that was one of the best shows of the tour. That was in Boise, Idaho, and man, did they come out for that. That was an amazing time, and it is like the moment you walk in, you're just like bombarded with lights and sounds. They had like little consoles at the bar where you could like put in an NES like cartridge and play Super Mario Brothers 2 while you're like having drinks and things like that. It was great. So that was, another positive experience at a somewhat unusual type of venue. And now we have our final question from Sean Hart. First, thank you so much for the Nietzsche podcast. I've listened to almost every episode so far, several more than once. Absolutely the best philosophy podcast out there. Thank you. Well, thank you, Sean, and I recognize your name. Thank you for supporting the show. Question. Nietzsche and Jung both grapple deeply with the death of God, but while Nietzsche saw this death as a tremendous creative opportunity, Jung's philosophy seems to culminate in arguing for a return to Christianity. Could you please speak to this key difference between Nietzsche and Jung? I mean, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. I mean, one of the things that's kind of funny, in covering The Undiscovered Self by Jung, I realized that, like, the likes of Jordan Peterson, like, this is his entire interpretation. I was about to say of Jung, but really of, like, reality is contained in this document. And that was a bit strange. I didn't really want to bring him up and kind of talk about that because I wanted to steelman the document and steelman Jung's arguments, but I realize it's not even like, yeah, Jung wrote a lot of things, but you don't even have to read anything in Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious or Jung's Red Book to understand where somebody like a pop philosopher, psychologist like Jordan Peterson is coming from, because it's all in The Undiscovered Self, right? And the whole thrust of that document is, yeah, we need to return to a religious grounding in order to steel ourselves against becoming swept away by the mass, something like that. And so I think that is the key difference between the two. There are some others, but that's the important one. And I'm trying to understand really what you mean by speak to it. I mean, it is their fundamental difference. And from my approach, I think it's very important to be aware of what the thinker that you're reading, like, what is their goal? What is yes, there's the formal arguments they're advancing, but what is the real meaning? And, this is like the method of James Burnham, as he talks about in the Machiavellians, that he, by the example of Dante, talks about the formal versus the real meaning of De Monarchia, right? The formal meaning is like a series of arguments about theology and politics that, would seem to, like, be advanced from the void, right? Like a perspective from nowhere based strictly on a reading of the Bible and through logical argument and so on and so forth. But really what's underneath it is that he's taken a side in a factional struggle of his own time and is taking a side in that struggle, right? So Jung, I think, so before I get into that, the important thing is to understand that there is a formal versus a real meaning, to put it in Nietzschean terms, to understand the philosophy as the unconscious and involuntary memoir of the author, that they're confessing something to you about their values, the moral or immoral intentions, which lay behind the philosophy that they're authoring, right? So you should be aware of that, but you don't actually have to take a position on that yourself in order to read it. You don't have to be like, oh, I'm on Team Nietzsche or Team Jung in order to read both of them. And I think it's actually important that you try not to. Because, look, it is a fact that you have your own biases and your own value judgments and your own agenda, and that is going to color how you see all these things. But you don't have to, like, play into that. You don't have to exacerbate that problem. You should actually resist those prejudices, those convictions that are, as Nietzsche says, more potent enemies of the truth than lies, and just try to, I don't know, again, like, it's why I say the episode Journey to Hades is so important, because it's like what I try and do is like breathe life into a dead human being and let them live again. And rather than having a devil and angel on my shoulder, this sort of insipid archetypal struggle between good and evil, whatever that means, I'd rather have Nietzsche and Jung on my shoulder, right? Or, take your pick, Plato and Rousseau, right? And try and construct like a complete thought model, a life model. Like, how did this person think? Where are they coming from? Pose the questions of like how they would think about certain things, and like try and like let them live and give them their due within my own sort of like psychological panoply, and to sort of have a place carved out for Nietzsche, a place carved out for Jung. And that's like the method that I'd advocate to all of you. Like, set them beside one another, let them have the conversation. And you can do this as an exercise if you want, as a conscious exercise. Have, with a given issue, what would Jung think about this? What would Nietzsche think about this? What would Jung say to what Nietzsche would think about this? What would Nietzsche say to what Jung would think about this? And so that's sort of what I would advocate. And so, yes, Jung wants a return to Christianity because he recognizes, I think rightly so, that Christianity, the moral and metaphysical foundations that it provides, are an essential ingredient for the Enlightenment, and therefore is probably necessary for the maintenance of our society, our culture, which is based on the Enlightenment. And Jung, I don't think it's just like cynically Jung saying, because many people do approach that cynically, like, okay, well then we need religion, so we have to kind of have it even though we don't believe in it. I don't think that's the way Jung's approaching it. We might make a comparison to Dostoevsky here, right? That the statement, if there is no God, all is permissible, doesn't really describe Dostoevsky. It's really the reverse. Because all things are not permissible, therefore there must be a God. And so, by analogy with Jung, I think the answer would be the rule of reason, the society based on human dignity and respecting everyone, like that has been this, undoubtedly produced prosperity and wealth and just advancement and elevation of the human condition. That depends on Christianity, therefore Christianity must be true. And I guess I was kind of struggling to find, like, well, what's an insight that I can really give about that? Maybe the insight is that the common misreading of Nietzsche is that Nietzsche is in that same vein. Well, Nietzsche thinks truth ought to serve life. That's not true. Nietzsche says that the strength of a soul should be measured by how much truth they can tolerate without having to have it muffled, sweetened, or falsified. So, again, that's a Jordan Peterson distortion of Nietzsche, that he thinks truth should serve life. But that's sort of the way that you actually get to that position is through a Jungian position of saying, okay, what served life, therefore it is true. That's not Nietzsche's position. His position is, if you want to strive for happiness and peace of the soul, then believe. If you want to be a disciple of truth, then inquire. That we're not going to have this placid fiction that truth will set you free or whatever. No, it is horrible and it can actually be fatal. That is the message Nietzsche takes from the story of Oedipus and Birth of Tragedy. But we're still going to eschew metaphysical comforts and try to see how much truth we can take on, like without it destroying us. That's the dangerous and exciting quest, the challenge of the philosopher. How much truth can I take on without being driven mad or destroying myself or having the world disenchanted to the point where I can't live in it anymore? That is really, I think, a key difference between Nietzsche and Jung, is that Nietzsche is not willing to say, sure, let's falsify the world, let's deceive ourselves, because the consequences would just be so bad if we didn't, right? Nietzsche doesn't think that way. He actually ridicules that method of thought, that there's actually no pre-established relationship between the truth and happiness, what makes us feel pleasure. And so we shouldn't look for truth on the basis of what makes us happy or what would have good consequences to believe in for the sake of trying to maintain society. Again, I don't think Nietzsche cares to maintain society. That would be maybe another difference that speaks to that divide between Nietzsche and Jung, is Jung saying, how do we preserve, how do we maintain this post-Enlightenment secular modernity? Well, we have to reinfuse it with Christianity, which is proof of Christianity's truth. Nietzsche would say, you can't save it. That's all good things must come to an end. And you're not going to be able to preserve it. And in fact, our modern morality that is playing a large hand in bringing down that society is in fact not anti-Christian. It's like hyper-Christianity. It's like Christianity that has stripped away all the superstitions and metaphysical trappings and aesthetics and is just pure morality, a pure delivery system for pity and selflessness. That's what's leading to the destruction of the society. And that's not because, oh, what a bad idea that we got convinced by. Let's all believe the good ideas. No, the reason why you got convinced by that idea is because you're a wearying, tiring, dying civilization. That's why you believe in these. That's why that we're seeing this acceleration of this morality of pity and selflessness, because that's what older, milder civilizations do. And so I think that's the answer to the question. That sort of speaks to maybe the differing agendas between Nietzsche and Jung, but also there's sort of a different epistemological orientation that really truth serves life. That's really more of a Jungian idea. Nietzsche's idea is the truth is hard, so we need to make ourselves hard, tough, courageous people in order to confront it, because that is the exciting quest of the philosopher. So that would be my answer. Thank you, everybody. This has been a fun one, and I'll read these last two comments I received. Good So Pink says, good luck with this one, Keegan. Question section is getting out of control. Yes, there were quite a few. And Robert Sullivan says, don't worry, Good So, if anyone can handle an out-of-control question section, it is Keegan. Leave me a comment and let me know if you think I handled it well. I think I handled some questions better than others, but that's why we do this. This is a little more informal. It's a little more fun for me. I can kind of just speak off the cuff and ramble a little bit at times, share my thoughts at times, and maybe give some answers. It's a lot of this is actually good practice for me for when I do live appearances or appear on other podcasts and I get asked questions where I have to delve into things, because some of these answers you could find, I would say, explanations for some of these things on past episodes, maybe in a more long-winded form and maybe in a more rigorous and intricate form. But it's good for me to have to put forward these ideas and elaborate upon them and defend them in off the cuff. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. I hope my patrons are satisfied with the answers you've gotten, however well I did. And if you're listening to this in the public release, which will come out in probably a couple weeks to a month, well, if you had joined the Patreon, you would have gotten this much earlier, and you would have probably gotten to ask a question as well. Well, definitely. I mean, it is getting to the point where I'm going to have to break these up into multiple episodes to answer all of the questions that I get from patrons. But as of now, I'm still managing it. So thank you for the vote of confidence, Robert Sullivan. I will continue to try managing it. Thank you very much, everyone. Signing off. Cheers. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.